The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 2nd chapter. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. And there he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, I don't know what to say except that, well, this reading is awful. And here we are just days after a joyous Christmas celebration when we as a congregation remembered the first Christmas night when Jesus was born. We heard the old story being told anew by the voices of Elizabeth and the innkeeper and Mary and even a wise man. We listened as the Gospel of Luke described the heavenly host spanning the sky above the shepherds to announce good tidings of great joy. And we sang the story over and over through the words of beloved Christmas carols. We left here Christmas Eve night, rejoicing in the birth of a baby, worshiping our newborn King. And now, just 5 days later, we find ourselves facing the ugly reality of Herod's murderous decree to kill all the male children in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. There are a few other stories in the Bible that are so gruesome, so horrifying. And so there really isn't anything other to say than what I've already said. It's awful. And I can't pretend I didn't just read it, and you can't pretend you didn't just hear it. So now what do we do with it? Well, first, we grieve the terrible loss. Just as the words of Matthew quote the prophet Jeremiah, we weep and we wail at the loss of those children. And we can acknowledge and grieve the fact that, unfortunately, the passing of 2,000 years hasn't changed a whole lot. There are still those in the world with power over their people who can call for mass murder in the form of genocide. So as we hear this story, we can't help but be reminded of another episode in the history of God's people. And we remember how another power-hungry ruler who launched a full-scale massacre, and we're reminded of another child who escaped death and grew up to lead God's people and carry out God's promise. Of course, I'm referring to Pharaoh and to Moses and the story of the Exodus. Over and over in the story of God and God's people, we see the mess that God's people make of things. And we realize that just as Herod wasn't much different from Pharaoh, who ordered death of the firstborn Hebrew males, well, neither are tyrants like Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, Assad, just to name a few. They aren't all that far removed from Herod either. And out of a time of despair and terror, God produced a hope, a future for his people in the leadership of Moses. And still the people, they lacked trust, they grumbled, still the people faltered, but Moses stuck with it, and God remained true. And in the aftermath of Herod's murder, Mary and Joseph and Jesus returned safely from Egypt. And God begins again the process of starting over and redeeming God's people, of redeeming the whole world. But this time, once and for all, this time in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And over, we see God's faithfulness. We see the continuous choice that God makes when God chooses us. And we shake our heads and wonder, what is God thinking? In this world of violence and power grabbing and greed, God came to us as a vulnerable, fragile human baby. Immediately after his birth, the sin and evil of the world threatened to end Jesus' life. Herod was scrambling. He was desperate. He believed his throne was on the line. His intelligence came in from 3 outsiders, men from a foreign land who seemed to know more about what was going on right under his nose than he did. The king was born, and the wise men from a foreign land came to pay him homage. And so he plotted to find the child and destroy this problem once and for all. But the wise men were too wise. They did not report back to him the location of the baby king, and he was furious. And as history has shown time and again, a power-hungry leader who fears that he is losing control is dangerous. So Herod decided the only way to protect himself and his power was to abuse it, perhaps in part reassuring himself that he still had that power. So Matthew's gospel tells us that on Herod's command, his guard went out and began killing. Lives were lost, families were destroyed. And though it is little consolation for the horror that he has caused to occur in the end, what we do learn is that Herod, the powerful and mighty king who exercised his power over life and death, now had no power at all when it came to his own mortality. The mighty king was still a mere mortal, and he died like everyone else. He had no real power. Mortal life must end, even Herod's. All his power couldn't stop that from happening. God's vision of love and peace for the world might be interrupted by the sins of evil leaders and unjust systems, but it won't in the end be thwarted. God's purpose of life and mercy is more powerful than leaders who will someday perish. And so we hear Matthew tell Herod's story, and we look back to Pharaoh, and then we look to other forms of genocide in Africa and Syria. And we see our own nation at war with itself, hate crimes against people of other faiths, races, sexual orientations, and the needless death of children, the ones we hear about in tragic school shootings, and the ones we don't hear about in situations of poverty, who lack nutrition and health care. So have we learned? Have we changed all that much? In the history of God and God's people in Egypt and again in Bethlehem, we can dare to see hope for ourselves. By our human standards, God should leave. God should just pack up, should write us off as sinful, selfish, angry people who just don't get it. But God won't. God never has. God never will. Just as our track record doesn't seem to change much, well, thankfully, neither does God's. God took on human flesh in Jesus. God took on human flesh and lived in our world, sharing our experiences. God lived in our world of violence and ugliness and sadness and death. God took on human flesh, human sadness, and God promises to overcome death and redeem humanity. If it had ever been in doubt before, we see that God has a stake in human existence. And God will not forget us or abandon us. God came and God laid it all out on the line. God came and put God's self into danger and into risk. God said, I love you this much. Loving puts us at risk. We have all experienced this in some way or another. Maybe we look at our children and worry for their safety and future. Maybe we look at our spouse and fear for the results of their last biopsy. Or maybe we look at our parents and wonder if this Christmas might be the last one we spend with them. And as we experience loss connected with those we love, we hurt and we grieve, and we know the risk of loving. But Jesus not only risked his life for love, In the end, he gave up his life for love. To the very end, he showed us how to love God and how to love one another. So what do we risk for our love of Christ and our love of neighbor? Our very lives are rarely on the line, but in this day and age, still there are things that we seem to value just as much. Our privilege, our opinions, our finances. Will we risk reaching out to the socially unacceptable, the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, the addict, those in prison? Will we risk advocating for rights of people of other races, immigrants? Will we risk what it is to tell people about our faith? Will we risk looking foolish or sounding fanatical? Will we tell the story of Jesus and his love without fear? And do we dare to share the hope and the promise of the good news? Will we stretch our financial comfort by making choices as consumers that are better for our environment, for God's creation, if not a little costlier on our wallet? God came as a fragile human baby and was immediately confronted with the world's sin. And from the moment God became incarnate in our same flesh, walked on our same earth, God's love for us put God's own life at risk. But then God went all the way to show us the limitlessness of God's love. It's a risky business, God's grace. But thanks be to God that God thinks that you and I and this whole world are worth the risk again and again. And so we live into that grace day by day, grieving the suffering of this world just as God does, but trusting, daring to hope, taking the risk that because of Christmas, love wins. Amen.